Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural Board Policy Review Committee for this term. My name is Kate Stamford, and I am chairing this meeting. We also have Director Toth in attendance, Director Bax in attendance, Director McMahon in attendance, and we have a couple of members in the gallery of the board, but they're not part of this committee. I'd like to start the meeting by acknowledging that we are meeting in the territory and the unceded lands of the Squamish and the Sechelt nations, and honored to be here. We have an agenda before us. We have a addition. I'm not sure if we have any further ones. Director McMahon, would you like to add the additional agenda item under new business, or I've got the wording for it?
Brilliant. Perhaps you could tell me what I'm saying. The additional item under new business would be advancing identified policies for revision, which appear on page 80 and 81 of the agenda package.
And that's by consensus, right? We don't need to vote on that. Is that correct? Okay. Is there any other additions to the agenda? If not, seeing none, I'd like to adopt the agenda as amended. I have got a first and second, and all those in favor? That passes unanimously. Thank you. And now we'd like to move on to reports. And Corporate Officer Reid, you're going to speak to this first.
Thank you, Chair. So good morning. And as a brief introduction, this is the first policy review committee of this board's term. I thought I would bring forward a couple slides to share to provide some context around board policy and where that actually fits within the legislative framework of the regional district. So I will share my screen. All right, so in this first slide, at a very high level, what you will see is the basic order of legislative authority, and this helps to guide us in determining what legislation takes precedent if there is a conflict between the various pieces of legislation. And at the top of that hierarchy is, of course, the Constitution, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as human rights legislation, and these are federally enacted and they reign supreme over all other legislation. Following that, we have federal statutes, which might include things like the Copyright Act or the Fisheries Act. Following that are provincial statutes, and the most commonly known within local governments, of course, the Local Government Act, the Community Charter. And following that, we have our local government bylaws. And then at the lower level of that hierarchy is common law, which is also known as case law. And what's interesting to note about common law is that, first of all, it is the lowest level of the hierarchy, and this is because legislation is the primary and paramount source of law. But it also should be noticed that there are times when case law will actually impact that order of authority. So if we focus on the legislative framework just to look at it from the regional district level, we can kind of see where our policies fit into that hierarchy. And at the top, we have local government bylaws, which really provide the basic framework for any law enacted by a local government. And bylaws set out the requirements to establish whatever regulatory scheme is being implemented by the board. Policies are then implemented to support those bylaws. So policies are the what and why, and they could be principles, rules, guidelines. They're typically adopted to influence and determine all major decisions, actions, and activities of the regional district. They enhance upon what is contained in the bylaw, they may provide more detail. There may be statements about policy issues that could be about the allocation of resources to provide services that are established within our bylaws. It should be noted that the courts do expect local governments to follow their policies to the letter of the law in order to avoid legal liability. And a further note about regional district policy is that it is either board or operational. And a few of the differences have been highlighted on this slide. So for example, board policies are more about guiding decision making. That we are legally liable to uphold these, and they may only be enacted or amended by board resolution, whereas operational policies govern more of the actions and activities at an administrative level for staff, and they're commonly described as practices. And these policies within the SCRD are approved by the CAO or the senior leadership team, and they may be changed or amended at any time by staff. They don't necessarily come to the board for approval. And then finally, we have procedures, and procedures are the how. Procedures are the steps that we take to implement the process which is set out by bylaw, further defined by the policy, and maybe refined even further by operational practices. So an example would be a bylaw delegates authority to the corporate officer to review requests to appear before the board as delegations. And the delegation policy might state the factors that need to be considered when approving or declining a delegation. And then the practices would be the procedures that staff implement so that we know what to do once a delegation has been approved or declined. You may have noticed that some of the current board policies do contain procedure, and there are arguments for and against that practice. And in the upcoming report on this agenda, we have made a recommendation regarding that. So this is actually a good segue to actually introducing the report in Annex A, whereby staff have drafted a policy and procedure framework for the committee's consideration. And the objective of this framework is to provide guidance and to encourage consistency in our development, approval, and review processes for all SCRD policies, procedures, and practices. Happy to take any questions the committee may have.
Is there any questions of Officer Reid? Seeing none, I'd like to move forward. I'd just like to make a comment that this represents a significant amount of work from staff. It's based on direction from our previous board. And although some of this looks like administrative and simple changes, it actually advances our work significantly. So I'd like to thank staff for all the effort that's gone into this. This is a step in providing recommendations to the board. We have, we're going to vote on the original staff report, the policy and procedure framework first. But then as we go into the other section, we'll talk about what our options are for recommendations. So there is a recommendation on page 2 that the committee adopt the policy and procedure framework as presented. And, okay. We have a question.
Yeah, my impression is that board policies focus more on things of public interest, like broad public interest. It doesn't actually say that. I'm going to point that out. It says impact the community. So that's merely a comment that I think things like social equity would be the sort of area where the board might want to make policy. But not going to amend on the fly, but for the next time around that this is being looked at, it's a comment.
That's a fairly important comment. Are you sure you don't want to make any recommended changes? Okay.
Recommendations on the fly.
I see no other questions of clarification or comments, so I'd like to call the vote. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Thank you. So our next item is on Annex B. And that is on page 9. And you can see the draft of amended policies. So we'd like to go through all the policies one by one. There's different recommendations for each one, and you have in front of you a page of options on how you want to proceed with those recommendations. And keep in mind that these recommendations have been based on work that was done in the prior term and advice from that previous board, but it's up to you how you'd like to move forward. So we'd like to start on page 13, and we'll start with the laying of the wreaths. And the recommendation here, cheat sheet, is it's minor changes. So how would you like to proceed? Would you have any questions of clarification?
Yeah, I was wondering why we specify a particular dollar amount, because that's the sort of thing that one might need to review and revise from time to time. Would it not be better to just state, give a donation, or maybe give an example, e.g. $100, and then that would leave some more latitude for inflation.
Are you expecting a comment from staff, or would you like to make a recommendation with minor amendments?
Oh dear. Well, a suggestion would be in 4.1, last part, a donation will be made to the respective Royal Canadian Legion. And would that be sufficient? And then we don't have to worry about dollar amounts. Thank you.
Did you catch that edit?
Thank you. Yes, I did.
Okay, we'd like to make adoption with minor amendments, and that's moved by Director Bax. Do I have a seconder? Director Toth. All those in favor? Passes unanimously, and we're on to number 2. So number 2 is on page 14, board administration, and minor amendments are recommended. All directors have questions, so we'll start with Director Bax.
So looking over this, this change in policy 4.5, where it reads at the end, or the alternate directors will not be provided, or having access to the camera files or in-camera files. So at some point, it allows for the alternate directors to take place of the directors in meetings, including in-camera meetings, but it doesn't. This part of the policy doesn't allow for them to have any of the in-camera files. I think that's a bit of a contradiction. They have to be able, should they be at an in-camera meeting for any reason, whether it's the director has to recuse themselves or they're unavailable to attend, the alternate director needs to have access to these in-camera files, and this policy states that they can't have it.
Corporate Officer Reid, do you have a comment?
Yes, I can provide further clarification on that. So this is an example where the legislation trumps our policy. So the legislation provides that alternate directors, when they are acting in the role of a director, have all the authority and access to that information when they're sitting in the director's role. The intent of this policy was really to provide clarity outside of that. So these were just some administrative items that came up. I remember when this came forward in 2017, we wanted to provide further clarity around how directors were appointed from the municipalities. And we also needed to provide this clarity around when an alternate director does attend an in-camera meeting and what access to that confidential information they would have. So it's specifically when they're not in the role of the director, which the legislation clearly sets out they're entitled to receive at that time.
Director Toth?
Sorry, it's a follow-up to Director Bax. I'm wondering if adding the word regular in there, so it would say, or regular access to in-camera files, would be enough to clarify that for people. So I'm, you know, I know Director McMahon also has something to raise, so I'm happy to include that and put a pin in it for the time being.
Is it clear where he wants it? The change?
Not immediately to me, thank you.
Can I get you to clarify where you want the
Yeah,
change?
so 4.5 would read, alternate directors will not be provided with corporate cell phones, other electronic devices, or regular access to in-camera files.
You got that? And Director McMahon?
Right. Yes, because in 4.4 it says that the alternate can attend an in-camera meeting. 4.3, in the absence of a director, but and then 4.5 it says you can't get the in-camera files. So it really needs to be clarified so that people understand what this means, even though there is legislation. So, I mean, another way to do the same thing would be that alternate directors do not have access to in-camera files except when acting in the absence of the director. And that would be hopefully crystal clear. I also sort of wanted to take exception to the title of the policy, because board administration doesn't tell me anything at all. I mean, it could be just about anything. And we're talking here about the roles of directors and alternate directors. So a more helpful title would be nice.
Do you have any suggestions?
No, it's, well, it could even be appointment of directors and alternate directors. Appointment is kind of the wrong word.
Would you like to leave it at for now? And
Yeah, we can
We'll
put a
move
pin in
on.
it for the moment and keep
Okay.
moving.
so right now, if there's no other questions, we've made which I consider minor amendments. Is there anything further?
What about if we called it Board Administration, directors and alternate directors? Would that perhaps clarify?
It's more clear. Sherry?
Just a bit of a process question, because we were amending section 4.5, if we could just maybe deal with that and
Stick
then
with that.
and then move to a different amendment in terms of the title, it would just help us track this better.
Director McMahon has a suggestion.
Yeah, for 4.5, my suggestion is that we break it into two sentences. So sentence 1 is, alternate directors will not be provided with corporate cell phones or other electronic devices, period. alternate directors will not have access to in-camera files except when acting in the absence of the director. Oh, it could be a 4.6, yeah. Good.
Did you get that? Okay. So we have a minor amendment. We can do both these changes. They're fairly minor, and then we can vote on them together. And the second one for title?
Board administration, directors and alternate directors.
So if I could get someone, if there's no other changes, or Director Bax?
I'll move we accept as with the minor amendments.
So you move that what is called right now? Board administration
Or-
policy be amended as with the following, the amendments as
Ye-
presented. Okay.
Yes.
So I had a mover, a seconder, Director McMahon. If we're ready to vote, all those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll get into a routine here. So the next one is page 15, and it's petitions and delegations. Do I have any questions of clarification? Director Toth?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask for some clarity here in that it doesn't mention anything in here about the committee or board chair having any approval within the process for delegations. So I'm just wondering if that's just a operational thing, or if that's something that we need to add here. Or if it's something the committee chairs don't actually have any jurisdiction over within their committees. Thanks.
Corporate Officer Reed, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'm just opening up the procedure bylaw because I believe that authority is provided by bylaw within the procedure bylaw, but just give me 1 second. Yes, so the authority for the chair to deny a delegation or approve a delegation is provided in the board procedures bylaw. So again, another example of we have a bylaw and then the policy further defines some of the steps involved.
Director McMahon.
But procedurally speaking, since the board agenda review generally takes place after the agenda has already been published, well, it has been lately. The cow agenda reviews have been on the Friday morning before the agenda is published. So if the board chair wanted to exercise their ability to deny a delegation after they already appeared on the agenda, it would be a little awkward. Anyway, that's a procedural problem, and I don't think it needs to be in the policy.
So I can further expand on that, so how it plays out. So typically, the first review goes through the corporate officer, and I would approve or decline in my role. The policy also provides the applicant the ability to appeal to the chair. So if a delegation is declined, they have a right to go to the chair to have that reversed. And I think the intention here is just to ensure that we cover the rights of the public to come before the board and present. So it's not intended to really be a gatekeeper as to who speaks and who gets denied. And there's very specific criteria as to when we would deny a delegation. So, but again, if the committee feels there needs to be more in the policy around that, we're open to those amendments.
What is your thoughts, committee? Do you want to have this tabled for a later time? Director Bax, you have a question?
Question of clarity. So this is a good example of the use of red and blue type, and I was wondering if you could give me some explanation as to the red type appears. Is this language that's been inserted into an existing document? Is it? I know that there's some strikeouts, which tells me that this was language that was there that was removed. But the red, is it inserted? And the blue represents what?
Thank you for the question. So this is a function of track changes and multiple people going into that document and making those changes, which are often indicated by color. So that would indicate that two people have provided edits if you see different colors.
And these edits are additions to?
Yes, so the text that is colored are the definitions, for example, were not in the policy prior. It was pointed out to me that we have a petitions and delegations policy, but we don't talk about petitions. I did take the liberty to add some information about petitions into the policy while I was reviewing it for those housekeeping changes.
Thank you. That's very clear now. Thanks.
I would like to move that the policy, petitions and delegations, be adopted as presented.
Seconder, Director, oh, okay. Further question, Director Toth?
Thank you. Looking at 4.1, it mentions that the full name and residential address of each petitioner must be included on petitions to the board. But I believe those would probably be severed before being published due to FOIPA and FIPA and all of those things.
Not necessarily. If a citizen is putting forward, there's less of an expectation of privacy if you're putting forward a position, a public position on an issue. So we wouldn't publish that on an agenda necessarily. So if a petition was served to me, the corporate officer, the board would likely receive it through a reading file. They would be made aware of it, but it wouldn't be something we would necessarily publish on an agenda. So we do some due diligence around the protection of privacy. However, people should know that if they are signing a petition, they should have no expectation of privacy.
Okay. I'm totally comfortable with that. I just wanted to make sure that if we were severing that information, that it probably should say that for anybody who's reading it. So thank you.
So we had a mover, seconder. Are we ready to vote? All those in favor? And that passes. Thank you. So our next item is on page 18, and it's pesticide use. Oh, no, agenda item submission deadline. I'm getting way ahead of myself. Page 17. And question of clarification from Director McMahon.
Yes, my question is, what is an item? Is an item a written report, or is it a motion, or is it just a verbal discussion, like under new business? What is an item?
So for the most part, the intent of this policy is to clarify timelines around agenda items and the criteria for when we'll accept them. So an item in that, we haven't formally defined it, but it refers to things that would trigger an amended agenda, such as a report or a piece of correspondence, some piece of information that the board would have to take in and contemplate before making a decision. And the idea with limiting late items is the context is good decision-making for the board. So we want the board to have time to contemplate the issue and to understand the issue that they're making a decision on. So if a summary report comes forward at the meeting, have you as directors had time to read it and contemplate it before you make a decision? Therefore, we put some barriers in there, and for staff as well. So once the agenda deadline is passed, and if they've missed that deadline, they would have to meet the criteria of this policy to get their item forwarded onto an agenda.
Follow up?
I understand the intent. My only concern is that the policy might be used to block members of the board from bringing up items of new business that just required some discussion. I mean, I'm trying to think of a worst-case scenario here, not the day-to-day business. And therefore, it might be helpful to define item as being a report, a piece of correspondence, or a motion. And then we're clear on what it's for.
Director Bax.
So I think I see what Director McMahon's getting to is the fact that this is to allow things that are coming from outside of the board to give the board time to for us to contemplate it. But there are certain times when members of the board would like to introduce something and they don't, and they feel that it should be brought forward. And if it's a simple matter that can be decided immediately, or we have the opportunity to table it or to do something like that. But I think that we're trying not to stifle ourselves with a policy like this. And so that under exceptions, we could add that any member of the board has the prerogative to bring forward an item late. Is that a bit too? That's a bit too open. But that's the idea. Is that we should have the opportunity to bring forward late items as a board.
I'll get a response from staff.
Thank you for the question. So I believe in the procedure bylaw, so the two mechanisms for directors to bring forward, and I won't call them late items. So the first one is an item of new business. So this policy is not meant to stifle that. And while we haven't actually defined new business, in practice, items of new business, when they come up on a board agenda, they don't trigger an amended agenda. They typically come up at the board table. It's an issue that's come up after the agenda's been published. It typically doesn't involve any background information, and it's a matter of importance that for whatever reason, the directors wish to bring forward in the meeting. So this policy does not in any way prevent that. And this is in your order of business, which is established in your procedure bylaw. And then the second way directors may bring forward late items is even by notice of motion. So you may come to a meeting and provide a notice of motion. We may not deal with the business of that motion, but it does give you an opportunity to bring that item forward, and then we would place it on the following agenda with the appropriate background information if it's so required.
Third follow-up.
Can I take a stab at adding exception G, that notice of motion or new business are exempted, are excluded from this?
You see where that is, Chris?
Well, it's just for clarity. I know it exists in the bylaw, but if for clarity to
Five.
include it in this
G, add a
policy,
G.
I think would be a good idea. So an exception is exception G, notice of motion and new business are accepted from this. Does that make sense?
Any need for clarification from the directors? Does that make sense? Director McMahon.
Yeah. I mean, I could go along with that. It's one of the tricks of these policies is that they keep telling us what we can't do, but they don't outline what corporate officer just outlined, which is the correct way to do things in a positive way. So we've always got these negative bylaws or policies, and it's difficult to navigate for directors who are trying to learn what is the way to do things properly. So at some point, perhaps we should have a procedure for directors on how to bring forward items of business to meetings, because it's challenging It really is challenging. It might be a procedure for a board procedure or something for us to have to help with the onboarding of new directors. So I'll support Director Back's proposed amendment.
Any, Director Toth?
Thank you. Yeah, I can support that amendment too, just for simplicity's sake. Looking at 4.1 though, it mentions that final form items should be submitted by noon on Friday, which is after we do our agenda reviews. And I get that there's things that come up during agenda review that could result in changes to a report that needs to then be coming forward. There's just a little bit of ambiguity there in that, you know, if somebody comes screaming into the corporate officer's office at 11:58 on the Friday with a totally brand new report, if they consider it to be final form, they can get it onto the agenda. I don't know if it's, you know, if it needs clarification, you know, final form of previously submitted drafts or something to that effect. I'd be curious to hear from the other directors.
Any comments or historical perspective might be helpful? Has this happened?
I don't have a lot of experience with this happening. So if the corporate officer feels that she can deal with a noon deadline, then I think that's probably okay.
Director Bax?
If this scenario does happen, will we have a chance to come and revisit this policy next year? Because, all right, so if this bites us on the,
Yeah, we always do.
if this happens, then we'll realize that we made a mistake here today.
So do I have a mover for a minor amendment that the agenda item submission deadline be amended as follows? And we've got the amendment for G. Director Toth moves. Do I have a seconder? We're doing it now. Director Bax is seconding his amendments. If there's no other questions, all those in favor? And that passes. Thank you. Okay, now we're on to pesticides use and invasive species amendment. The staff recommendation for this is requiring a major overhaul, and you can go to page 18. Any questions of clarification? Director McMahon.
Yeah, I think this does need to be overhauled. I totally understand, and it needs to remain in place while the overhaul is going on. This is something that might be the I know that invasive species comes up a lot, and we get a lot of questions from the public. And there have been previous reports. Perhaps if there is a previous report explaining what our current policies and practices are around invasive species, maybe it could be sent to the current board to inform us or refresh our memories on where we're at with this. Because once again, I'm getting a lot of questions from the public on this subject, and it's largely a provincial matter, and there are a number of issues around it, but an education piece would be helpful. I'm not sure that we need a new report. We probably have material available already. So perhaps a direction to staff to just check back for information on this topic. Thank you.
Staff have confirmed that. Is there any other questions or comments about this recommendation? Director Toth?
Thank you. Just procedurally here, looking at the menu of options, you know, that the invasive pesticide use and invasive species management policy be brought forward to a future committee for further review and major revision. reads as if we're gonna be sitting here writing policy on the fly
Yeah.
at the next meeting. So I'm just seeking some clarity in the recommendation that we're actually being asked to make.
Staff, would you like to provide a more clear recommendation, possibly?
Yes, so the referral would take it back to staff. And the process would be that staff would propose an amended policy and then bring it forward to the committee for their review and consideration. So maybe we indicate that it be referred back to staff to bring forward to a future committee, if that's clearer.
Does that help, Director Toth? Okay. Director Bax?
I move that we refer this matter to staff for them to bring back to a future committee.
Do I have a seconder? Director Toth, all those in, if no other questions, all those in favor, and that passes. Okay, so our next one is on page 20. It's the procurement policy. Director McMahon.
Generally, this is quite a new policy, so for the most part, I think it's in good shape. But the table at the bottom of page 21 specifies items between $25,000 and $50,000, and then greater than $75,000. But somehow, everything between 50 and 75 got lost. So, yeah. Oh, we can't buy anything in that range. That would be good. So I'm assuming that the third item in the chart should read 25,000 to 75,000. Is that correct?
Good catch. I think staff have those changes. Is there any other questions? Director Toth.
Looking at 3.10 on page 21, at the top of that page, local vendor bidder, so the local's been struck out, so we now are requiring all vendors and bidders to have a physical address on the Sunshine Coast? I mean, that's great for, you know, social procurement and things like that, but I wonder how, like, our engineering firms and, you know, the bigger organizations that we rely on feel about that particular requirement.
Can I get confirmation from staff? Is that a typo or is that the intent?
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. Because this is a definition and we don't refer to local vendor or bidder in the rest of the policy, I simply removed that. It's not that we don't want them to be local, it's just that it's defining local and then we don't use that term again. Happy to leave it as is and not remove that term.
Does that answer the question? It didn't to me.
Yeah, I mean, the other directors, I assume, get where I'm coming from with the question, because, you know, if we delete the word local, it then means that all vendors and bidders and, you know, sorry, I don't know, XYG Consulting, you're based out of Surrey, you can't do business here. So it's, I don't mind either leaving local or just deleting the entire 3.10 definition.
Director McMahon.
I'm just wondering if we should defer this to the end of the agenda and give staff time to check with procurement staff to make sure that we're doing it right. And then we could come back to it.
So we're just going to table this recommendation for now. Oh, nope. Director Bax?
Yeah, I just have one more question. So I agree we should table it to give some people a chance to look at it. But I'm wondering, so these definitions, they're defining part of our bylaws or part of, not this procedure. It's part of the procurement, the small purchase guidelines and the other procurement procedures that we have. Is that so? These definitions are used in our procurement. So if at some point there's a weight that's put to a local vendor over an off-coast vendor, that's where this definition would come into place. But we're not always asking for every vendor to be local. Is that correct?
Staff?
Thank you for the question. So the definitions in this policy are defining the terms that are used within this policy, not necessarily by law. But again, we can certainly talk to the procurement department about the term local and see what the intent was at the time the policy was initiated.
Director Toth?
Thank you. I've got one other question. On page 22 near the bottom, I guess it's former 4.15, there's a section here that's being recommended for deletion with the award recommendation reports for evaluated solicitations, including the company names of all unsuccessful respondents and aggregated pricing. And I know that that was a change that we brought in the last board to sort of improve transparency and reporting back. I'm really hesitant to remove that section, although I do recall we had a brief discussion about it at one point in the past. I just can't remember where we went with that discussion. Thank you.
Director McMahon, would you like to respond?
I remember that discussion well, and that discussion also got into consistency between how other governments report bids. So I don't remember all of the details right this minute, but I see staff looking eager.
Would staff like to respond?
Yes, thank you. I think that this is the amendment that brought forward all of the bids into a public meeting. And the reason we're reviewing, suggesting that we strike this, is it actually puts the regional district at legal risk to name all of the bidders and the prices. And typically that would be something, if the board wanted to see that, we would do that in camera. And there's several reasons for that. There's reasons within FOI legislation around, we have a responsibility to protect the competitive edge of these businesses. So I remember an example where a bid came out and we published all the amounts and the names of the bidders. And then the board, we went back and we had to reissue that tender. So that gave the other bidders an advantage to see who was doing what and how much they were bidding. Because typically when a company bids on a process, they're blind to what others are putting forward. So this is something that we've actually had legal advice on, and it's not recommended that we bring it forward into an open public meeting.
Director McMahon?
I'm wondering if simply striking the word publicly from publicly report award recommendations, that would allow you to bring it to an in-camera meeting, but it wouldn't have to be on a public agenda and achieve the same thing.
Staff respond? Director Toth?
I think there's some
Nope.
ambiguity about the question that was there, so I'll wait a second.
I'm just curious. So the question is, if we strike the word public, is that sufficient to signal that the board would wish to maybe see these recommendations in confidence? Is that the question? And yes is the answer.
And
Okay.
maintain the stricken words. Reinstate the stricken words.
Yes.
Is that clear enough for directors? Director Toth?
Yes, I think it is. Just before we table it to the end of the meeting, though, on page 23 on the third paragraph of the page, there is actually reference made to local bidder. So just to further complicate procurement's hasty review of the use of the word local. Thanks.
So do we need to make a motion to table this, or can we just bring it back at the end?
We can adopt what's been decided and then circle back and add a recommendation at the end. And we will confer with purchasing to confirm the definition while the other policies are being reviewed.
But we have a couple other suggested changes as far as I understood.
Yes, so far I have a notice to, a recommendation to insert a line into the table on page 21 for 50 to 75,000, and to potentially strike the word public from section 4.15.
And then there's something to do with local.
Publicly is weird.
Oh, and local's coming at the end, right?
Yes. Was
Oh.
there something else?
So if those suggested amendments are Director Bax.
So in the 4.15, it's to strike the word publicly and to reinsert the stricken language that's there. Is that what that's what I understand? So reinsert these award recommendations, reports for evaluate, et cetera.
Okay.
Are we clear? Director Bax, or Director Toth, sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted clarity when we're looking at that table on page 21. Did I hear that there was going to be another line inserted? Because I think it was just that perhaps the third line was supposed to have the 50 changed to 75, looking at the rest of the table. Unless there is another tier that's being added to this table. Yeah.
I'm wondering if that can come back at the end of the meeting as well.
I think we should get clarification on that.
So we'll wait to get clarification on those two items, but meanwhile, we do have some agreed upon amendments that we'd like to vote on. Director McMahon?
I kind of feel like we need a slightly broader discussion of the degree of transparency that we feel is appropriate in purchasing. It's in procurement. It's, on the one hand, we need to be well away at arm's length because we do not want to get involved in the weeds of procurement. On the other hand, the board really wants to be assured that procurement is being done to the best standards and is being really successful. And it's hard for us to judge if we have no information other than the final award, because we don't see any other metrics really on is our policy supporting local businesses? We don't know. So it raises for me some cans of worms that might require slightly broader discussion. And I would feel more comfortable broader discussion with the board or something.
Director Toth?
Thank you. And it's an interesting point because when you talk about the metrics, there's so much that goes into scoring a proposal. You know, the overall financial cost of it was the one that we just latched onto, but maybe the metric that we should be asking to be reported publicly is the aggregated score of the proposal, because that factors in so many more things. But you're right, we do need to have a broader discussion on what we want as a board and what we think our public wants and what we can actually accomplish under legislation and protection of privacy for these businesses.
So may I suggest that we bring this back, it go back to staff, and that we bring this back at a later time? Okay, do I have a mover of
Well,
option 3?
Just one further comment, and yes, I think it should be referred back to staff, but we are members of the Social Procurement Initiative, and it's a great thing, and I get all their newsletters, but I have no way of evaluating how successful our program is. and whether we're achieving the goals. So if those comments could go back to staff, just, it may not be something to be reflected right here in this policy, but it is a broader discussion that we really should have. So thank you very much.
Director Toth.
Thank you. And I'm wondering if we talk about wanting to have a broader discussion with the rest of the board, if this should be brought to a future committee of the whole, rather than a future policy review committee. Because then we can have that broader conversation when it comes back.
an important one.
So,
Can I get someone to make that motion? Nope. Staff?
Good, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Someone? Anyone? Director Toth? You're gonna move it? And
Well, I was gonna move that we bring it back to the committee of the whole after staff has had a chance to review.
Director Bax makes the motion,
I made the motion
Yeah.
right underneath your nose.
yeah, you sure did.
and I've got Director McMahon seconding it. All those in favor?
Motion, right?
That passes. Okay, the next item is on page 27. It's use and insurance of rental and personal vehicles.
What the hell is that? Yeah,
Your microphone's on too, by the way.
Do we have any questions or comments? Director McMahon.
I'm afraid, as always, I seem to have questions. So I was just curious because it says very clearly here, upon receipt of a written request and documentation from the insured director or alternate director or staff, and with the approval of the CAO, the SCRD will reimburse the director or whatever for the difference between personal and business insurance coverage. And that caught my attention because, in fact, I have had to increase my insurance coverage for the reason that I am driving to SCRD meetings. On the other hand, the absolute amount is not very much, and it's a pain. So I'm just curious if this has come up. Staff probably don't know, but I don't know how many people would pursue this.
Staff somebody like to comment?
Sorry, we don't have an answer to that here. We would have to refer back to the CFO. Not to our knowledge that it has come up, but we would definitely have to refer back to the CFO.
Director Bax, do you have a comment?
Yeah, this was a bit of a surprise to me. I didn't realize that I needed to change the insurance on my vehicles. I have two vehicles that I arrive at the Field Road office in, and one of them is my pickup truck that I use for business, and it's artisan insurance. And the other one is my motorcycle. And so am I to understand that I need to increase the insurance on these vehicles to business use?
Director McMahon.
Speaking inappropriately for ICBC, when I insure my vehicle, pleasure use only includes up to 2 or 3 meetings per month is considered still use. But if you drive to something you're getting paid for, like a meeting, more often than you're supposed to get business coverage. But that's outside of the scope of this policy, I believe.
Director Toth.
I mean, there's also the to and from work less than or greater than 15 kilometers. I think the idea is that if you're using your vehicle to conduct SCRD business, so if you're going from here during the day up to Pender Harbor and you're taking a truckload of supplies for a community engagement session with you, that's conducting SCRD business with your vehicle. But just coming to the boardroom to work is not conducting business because you're not working while you're driving.
I have to disagree with that definition. I think that coming to the boardroom to work is conducting SCRD business.
I'm wondering if this is kind of getting beyond what the policy committee is looking at here. Director McMahon.
Right, and our questions are not in fact about the policy, only about ICBC. So, and our responsibilities, but I actually think the policy as amended is fine.
Thank you. Do I have a mover, Director Bax, and seconder, Director McMahon? If we're ready to vote, all those in favor? Great, thanks. The next item is to look at is on page 29. It's support service allocation. Any questions? Director McMahon.
Here I go again. So, on page 34, it appears that there will be no exceptions to the policy under authority to act. And I want to know why we're not going to have any exceptions.
Staff.
Thank you for the question. So this policy owner is through the CFO. You know, it is the committee's prerogative to put that back into the policy should you wish to have some flexibility. But you're correct in saying that it's been stricken, and as it's amended, there are no exceptions provided for within the policy as it's written.
Director McMahon, follow up.
So my explanation for this is that this was a great bone of contention with the Gibson's Library because the SCRD was taking 15% off the top of the tax requisition, despite the fact that the library does all its own support services. It does financial, payroll, IT, HR, and all of that directly through the tax requisition. And so taking 15% off for basically nothing was highly contentious, to put it mildly. And I believe there was some sort of an exception negotiated whereby it was a lesser amount was deducted for support services. I don't know how that would affect the Seashelt Library, but it was certainly true for the Gibson's Library.
Director Bax?
So I, at some point, I read through this and I wrote the word operational. Now, how does this particular policy differ from an operational policy rather than a board policy? Is this not one of those ones that would, it's kind of ambiguous?
Staff, would you like to respond?
Yes, because it does impact primarily support services. It's an operational function. So we provide, it's the regional district financial model. So in the policy, this is one of the areas where the board is adopting an allocation of our support services resources and how they're allocated throughout the organization, which would be why that would be a board policy.
Director Toth.
Thank you. On page 33, immediately under the table, is item number Q, which is Mason Road Works Yard. And it specifically mentions includes the cost of maintenance, utilities, and debt servicing associated with the transit fleet building, but not the rest of the structures on the property. I just was wondering whether it's specifically, whether Q is limited to just transit and fleet, or whether transit and fleet are extraneous in this context.
Are staff able to clarify?
Well, my interpretation when I look at Q is it refers to Mason Road Works Yard. Would that cover the other structures you're referring to?
I would expect that when we say Mason Road Works Yard, that includes everything on the property.
Correct.
But the actual definition that's, or the item 2 that's under it, specifically says transit fleet building. So I don't know if, sub-item 1 is missing, or if, Yeah,
I interpreted that as includes, but
Yes.
is not complete. That it just to specify it does include it. It doesn't specify what it doesn't include. Not helpful. Staff.
Yes, so often that language includes, does not preclude the other things. So it commonly used in bylaw language. So what we're saying there is it is the Mason Road Works Yard, including, we're making particular mention of this one particular building, but not precluding others. That would be my interpretation.
Would you like further clarification in the wording? No. Okay, Director McMahon.
That sub-item should be 1, not 2. So that's a minor amendment. I would like the exception to be put back in to this policy, and I'm just not clear whether it would it be under 5 exceptions? But I would prefer to see the ability to accept this policy, because we do have some pretty weird services.
So we have an amendment. I wouldn't say it's super minor, but it's minor enough. So could I get, and if there's no other comments or questions, could I get a motion? Director McMahon.
I'd like to move this with the 2 amendments, the correction of the sub-item 1 and the reinstatement of the exceptions to the policy.
Do I have a seconder? Director Toth? We're ready to vote? No, we have a question from Director Beck.
Will we be doing this again next year?
I'm sure we will. Could be something different, though.
The intention of the Board Policy Review Committee is to ensure that the board puts their eyes on their policy suite at least once per year. So there will be at least one meeting of the Board Policy Review Committee every year. Further to that, just to clarify, all of the policies that are under development and being amendment, they'll come forward at any time in any committee meeting. They don't only need to come forward through this committee meeting, through this particular committee. And then the role of this committee is just to really ensure that we just have our eyes on them at least once per year.
This particular policy, I see it has a lot of amendments to it in the last decade, and I would like to revisit it at some point. But I'm fine with it the way it is now, or the way that we've amended it.
I'm just confirming that the minute taker got those amendments. Thank you. Okay, if there's no further questions, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor? And that passes. Thank you. So we've been at this over an hour. Are we good to keep going?
Yeah.
Great.
Take a break
At 11, okay. The next one is on page 35, debt management policy. Director McMahon.
On the bottom of page 36, our policy is to limit debt servicing costs to 15% of our revenue. And I know that it came up in discussion at budget that we may not be able to stay within that limit, given the very large costs facing us for landfill and water. So I guess what would happen then is if we have to borrow more than we would have to amend our policy, would that be the, like, which way do we want to go about this?
Staff?
Trying to channel the CFO. I think that the limit has been put in there for a reason and as a flag. And should we come to a place of needing to change that limit, I would suspect that the preference would be that we amend the policy. I feel like she has it here for a reason, to flag it to our attention. And I don't know if it's aspirational or if it's a hardline limit, but that's something we could go back and check in with her on. But Yes, if we did exceed that, we likely would have to make an amendment.
Director Bax.
Yeah, I see that this is most likely it's a trigger to come back and make an amendment should we hit this threshold. It's like when I'm using my cell phone and I'm getting close to my data usage, I get a message. And so it's there as a flag that'll pop up if we're getting too close to it.
Good analogy. Did you have a comment, Director Toth?
I did, and maybe it's just the way that I'm reading it, but when I read that particular line, it provides just enough ambiguity to me that when we talk about maximum debt servicing costs, I assume we're talking about the organization as a whole, not on a per service level or a per service basis. But I'm just wondering if it should be clarified to specify, the organization as a whole, because, thank you.
Would you like to make that amendment, or Director McMahon?
I take the point, but I don't think we need to make the amendment. Because I remember this discussion coming up during budget, and it is intended as an overall, like investment income. Yeah. I think we're good on this one. And yes, we can always override our own policy if things get bad.
So is somebody ready to make a motion? Director McMahon.
I'll move that the policy titled whatever it is, debt management, be adopted as presented.
Seconder? Director Toth. All those in favor? And that passes. Next, Director's reimbursement of travel and other expenses, page 38. Director McMahon.
I only had one minor suggestion, which was to add the word directors back in so that it would say reimbursement of directors' travel and other expenses, just for pure clarity, so as not to confuse it with staff. Yeah. Let's not go there. Let's just reimbursement of directors, travel, and other expenses.
And you got that edit there, up at the title. Great. If there's no other comments, would somebody like to call a vote? Director Toth. Director McMahon, second. All those in favor? And that passes. And the next one is page 41, constituency expenses. Director Bax.
I don't see any changes to this. Is there any edits made on this policy at all? I don't
Staff?
see any.
This policy was amended on February 9th of this year, which is why it's coming forward. At the time when it was identified for housekeeping amendments, we hadn't done any work on it, but in the meantime, this is one that we did bring forward, and the board adopted it on February. So we're not suggesting any housekeeping amendments at this time.
So would you like to move?
I'd move that we adopt it as presented.
Seconder? Director McMahon? If there's no other questions, we can call the vote. We got a weird look on Director Toth's face.
My understanding is it's already been adopted, so it's just here for information. We don't actually have to vote on this at all.
We don't have to vote on this at all. They didn't tell me that in my cheat sheet. Thank you. Let's move on. Director's travel accident insurance on page 44. And we're not going to get into the ICBC rights and wrongs on this one, please. Yeah, it's recommended for repeal. So what I have is that traveling accident insurance is recommended for repeal, but I don't see that on the page. Can I get staff to clarify?
Thank you for the question. So the policy owner did recommend repeal for this policy. However, there was another general manager who recommended that we actually leave this policy as is with minor amendments. So this policy has track changes should the committee wish to keep it with amendments. However, the policy owner has recommended repeal.
Director McMahon.
I'm guessing the policy owner is HR.
The policy owner is the CFO for this particular policy.
Director Bax.
So, is there anything to replace this policy? Are we covered, under any other policy for this type of incident?
Can I get clarification from staff?
Thank you for the question. There was some discussion about adding this 4.1 clause into another policy, but it's unclear which policy it would be added into. So a suggestion could be that the committee refer this back to staff for further work to find another policy we could add this to, or make further amendments to this existing policy.
Director McMahon.
The problem with referring it back and not actually repealing it is that I'm pretty sure we're not doing this. So if we have a policy that we are in fact not following, that's kind of a problem. And so our question really is, are we covered by other insurance? So is this necessary or not necessary? And so that would be a question to HR.
Is this something we can hold off until the end of the meeting and get further clarification on? Okay, we're just going to table this till the end of the meeting and find out whether we get coverage for losing our limbs on SCRD business. Okay, so we're just going to leave that one. And we're now down to, oh, I'm starting to lose. Okay, so we're on page 45, and it's screening officer bylaw notice. And I have a question about that. So in part of this one, it specifies about emergencies, it's specific on emergencies. Let me just get down to it. It speaks specifically to medical emergencies in section 4.1 DI. And I would note that there's probably other kinds of emergencies. For instance, if somebody is cutting trees due to incoming fire, those kinds of things, I'm wondering if it's worth putting, just taking out the word medical. Any comments from other directors? Director McMahon.
I have a question, and that is, what is a screening officer? I read this whole thing and I couldn't figure that out. So perhaps we could explain under definitions what a screening officer is, so that to assist the people reading this policy.
I concur. Staff?
I can offer a brief explanation. So, when we issue a notice, what they're really referring to are ticketing bylaw tickets. And if somebody is disputing a bylaw ticket and the ticket is issued under the bylaw enforcement notice bylaw, there is a process for adjudication. And prior to going to adjudication, there are designated staff positions who are screening officers per that bylaw. And the screening officer's role is just plainly determine was there in fact a bylaw contravention. And once the screening officer makes their call, the matter could then potentially proceed to adjudication if the ticketed individual still believes that they have a case to make.
Follow-up?
So if this relates to bylaw enforcement, are those other policies board policies, or are they operational policies? Like, how does this all fit together, and why is this one a board policy?
So when I say bylaw enforcement, I'm referring to contraventions of within our municipal ticketing bylaw and our bylaw enforcement notice bylaw. So these are ticketing violations within the regional district that we're referring to, that our bylaw officers would go out and attend to.
Further questions? Director Bax?
I'd like to make a motion to amend item 4.1 DI. The contravention was a result of an emergency, example, medical or state of emergency.
Staff, you want to comment?
Well, I would just clarify that section 4.1D, the main intent of that is that the contravention was necessary for the preservation of health and or safety, and that the medical emergency is just an example.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
So I'm sure there's many examples of health or safety, but we wouldn't itemize them specifically in the bylaw, which begs the question if we should strike the example if it causes confusion. But it's not specific to a medical emergency. The provision is specific to the preservation of health and or safety.
That would be my preference, but Director McMahon?
I actually think it's fine as it stands, but I just noticed that F has items 2, 3, and 4, but no 1, so there is a numbering problem there again.
So I would like to recommend removing DI completely. It makes it more clear. Director Toth?
Thank you. I'm not sure that it does make it more clear because, the preservation of health is a pretty ambiguous term on its own. I think I need this giant beach access that I'm not otherwise allowed to build for my health, right? I think stating in here that, medical emergency, as an example, I think gives the screening officer a little more rigidity in what they're trying to define against.
Okay, I'm willing to sit on this. Any other comments about this motion or this policy? Did we have, sorry, I'm sort of getting a little bit lost. Did we have any other amendments on this one? No. Yeah. It was just the numbering? Okay. Okay. Okay, if we're ready to move this, do I have a mover? Director Bax, seconder Director Toth. All those in favor? Staff?
Point of clarification, was that motion to strike or to strike it?
We
or
just left it the way it was.
You've left it. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to have a 10-minute break to get more coffee. And that passes. Thank you. Welcome back after our break. Director Toth is just coming into, that's okay. Just coming into the meeting. And we would like to go back to page 44, the director's travel accident insurance. We have Senior Manager Jerry Parker is available to answer our questions about how or when or should we repeal that particular policy. So, Mr. Parker, if you'd like to respond to our general questions about the status of that particular policy, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks very much. The answer is that all directors currently do have, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. All directors do have coverage while on SCRD business only. That includes the municipal directors. It's through AON is the service provider. So I wasn't suggesting it be repealed. I know that apparently came up. It certainly could be incorporated in another policy if the directors wish. And then the other part of this is that municipal directors are not eligible for additional coverage, but rural area directors are eligible for additional AD&D coverage. And I know there was a package sent in the fall when just after the election results. So that remains available. Municipal directors would have to go through their respective municipalities or organizations, Shell Nation. I hope that helps to clarify things.
Thank you. Director McMahon, do you have a question?
Well, not so much a question, but this, I mean, our insurance coverage generally is part of our HR package, and it doesn't seem to me that we need a separate policy just for this. So I'm personally happy with repealing it, but I'll listen to other directors.
Director Bax?
Yeah, so what we're saying here is that repealing this is not going to take away insurance that we already have. So that, yeah, that's fine then.
Can I have somebody make a motion? Would you like to have a further comment, Manager Parker?
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear that this is actually, we do not provide benefits to all directors. We provide benefits to rural area directors, and the other municipalities have their own arrangements. So this is specific to ensuring there is coverage while on SCRD business. But if directors feel adequately covered by their insurance packages at their respective organizations, that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Director Toth.
So if I've got AD&D through the municipality to cover while I'm on the business of the municipality, and I'm sitting here as a regional district director, do I get coverage from the municipality's insurance when I'm doing SCRD business?
Senior Manager Parker, can you respond?
I'd actually have to, thank you for the question, I'd have to steer you back to your respective municipalities for them to actually provide that answer to you.
Can I suggest we not repeal this just yet?
It's been on the fence back and forth, so if you'd like to make a motion.
One more question of clarity. Repealing this is not going to change my coverage at all. Is that correct?
It doesn't sound like you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, I know. I know, but that's still not an answer. I understand that it may change what's going on in the chair beside me.
Staff, could you just clarify one more time, please?
Well, thank you for the question. The policy as it stands says we will provide this. So if there's no policy to provide benefit coverage, I'm not sure what the board would like to do. And as mentioned, there are different municipalities, and the Shishelt Nation has also their own. So I would proceed with caution, I guess. Thank you.
CEO.
My understanding is that the policy, as it currently exists, would cover rural directors, not municipal. If we repealed the policy, it would make no difference to the rural directors, and because the policy doesn't cover municipal already, it would also not make a difference to the municipal directors. That's my understanding.
Director Toth.
The policy says all direct board members. Doesn't say rural board members.
That's why it's being repealed.
So I
Director
gue- I
McMahon.
guess the clarification, and I don't know that I know the answer then, is whether or not the existing policy, if repealed, would change coverage for municipal directors.
Do we have a solution, Director McMahon?
I would like to refer this back to staff and ask them to come back to us with a unanimous recommendation.
I second that.
They'd like us to come back with the unanimous
If there's no other questions, I would like to call the vote. All those in favor? And that passes. Thank you. Okay, our next one is street lighting, and that's on page 47. Director McMahon.
This is recommended for repeal, and I am absolutely fine with that.
Director Bax.
Yeah, I just have a question about, there's a number of policies here that are recommended for repeal. Now, what is the thinking behind the recommendation for repeal? Is it different for each one? Is there overlap? Or is that basically, I've got that, right?
I can provide a very basic outline for this one. Staff recommend this policy be repealed, as there are there's 8 other bylaws that give the SCRD the authority to install street lighting. And if you require further clarification, I can ask staff. It sounds like we're good. So do we have a recommendation from the board? Director McMahon?
Motion to repeal the street lighting policy.
Director Bax seconds, and we're ready to vote. All those in favor? And that passes. The next one is also a repeal. It's page 48. It's the independent power production development, and it's being repealed and referred to the OCP renewal project, as this would be more impactful as part of the official community plans. Any comments? Director McMahon?
I move just exactly what you said.
Do I have a seconder? Director Bax? All those in favor? Thanks, that passes. Okay, let's move on to page 63. This is the SCRD park naming. Oh, I'm up, sorry. I don't have a page number for water main. 61, funding for water main extensions draft. It's recommended as a repeal, and I don't have a reason for it. Any clarification from staff? Director Hall, do you have a, that's for, it's, yeah, GM Hall, sorry. Interim GM is for GM Mark Brown. Oh, okay. Christine, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Chair. The acting GM responsible for this policy made this recommendation. It might be covered in bylaw, but we're not 100% sure, but the recommendation was to repeal it.
Okay, repeal without totally understanding why. Director Toth.
Thank
Comments?
you. I mean, yeah, if you read section 4, it was clearly a one-off project and something that was in draft and never made it through to completion. So I'm happy to move repealing this.
And that's seconded by Director McMahon. If we're ready to vote,
Oh, just for clarification, that is, this is something that is no longer pertinent, and it's, so it doesn't need to be covered by, in any other policy or bylaw? Is that correct? Okay, fine.
are we ready to vote? All those in favor? And that passes. Okay, now we're on to SCRD park naming. That has been suggested as a major overhaul. If you go to page 63, you'll see the detail. Questions?
We're going to combine this with the, it's park naming and room naming are going to be combined, and I think that's a great idea. And do directors get any input on these naming chances?
As long as it's not yourself. Director McMahon.
That actually is a good question, because I don't think we've named anything in the last 5 years, to my recollection. I don't think we've had any new parks or buildings or any, oh, well, the rooms in the office obviously have been named, but the rooms in public facilities, I don't think that's come up either. So, yes, good time for an overall renaming policy that would take in all sorts of things. Thanks.
Personally, I'd love the chance to name something within my community to honor a community member. There has been several that we've lost recently that we would like to remember. And if that's a possibility, then I'd love to see that happen.
Director Bax, do you have a comment? That was it. If we have no other comments and questions, could I have somebody make the motion? Director McMahon?
Yes, move that the park naming policy be referred to staff for review and revision.
Director Toth? The vote, all those in favor? And that passes. The next one is development variance permits, and that's on page 64. We're amending, there's track changes, so it's minor amendments. Is there any comments or questions? Director McMahon?
Is this policy being looked at as part of the planning enhancement process? Because it seems to me that it's sitting there kind of all by itself. Oh, look, there's the GM of planning.
General Manager Hall, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is definitely in scope. Thanks.
So in
Follow-up?
other words, if we adopt this with the amendments shown, that will fill the gap in the interim until broader policy changes come forward. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's right. These are just, what's proposed here is just housekeeping to improve legibility. Thank you.
Director Bax?
Section under policy 4.2, either to change the language to say the preceding criteria or to move it above, because there's nothing following it. So would that make more sense? Okay.
I think we can make that adjustment. So if there's no further comments, if I could get someone to make a motion. Director McMahon?
Sure. Move that the development variance permits policy be adopted with the amendments as covered.
Seconder? Director Toth, calling the vote. All those in favor? That passes. Our next one is on page 65. It's geohazard acceptability and development approval. This is recommended as a major overhaul. Is there any questions? We've got GM Hall on the line. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Staff presented to another committee last week, and part of about the upcoming official community plan review, and we described how there were some urgent fixes needed to address some policy related gaps, and this was always in our mind. And the work that's been done between that committee and this one actually leads staff to recommend that this be repealed. And the reason for the repeal is that we've identified that there are inconsistencies between this policy and the current BC flood hazard area land use management guidelines and the engineers and geoscientists BC professional practice guidelines. And so rather than waiting to amend it, which we may bring back a policy for your consideration as part of that official community plan work, repealing this would actually enable staff to operate in alignment with those, with that legislation and guidelines, allowing the regional district to conform to those and limit risk. So rather than waiting, we recommend that this be repealed at this time, and then staff would follow up with more information about a possible future replacement policy if one is indeed needed. Thanks.
Committee, what is your pleasure? Director Toth?
Thank you. GM Hall basically answered the question that was in my head. I was like, this seems like something we don't even really need anymore. So given his recommendation, I'm happy to move that we repeal this.
And Director McMahon seconds. Okay.
Just a point of clarity, so that in the absence of a policy, we operate under the legislation that's laid down by the provincial government, correct?
GM Hall?
That's right, except it's a guideline, not legislation, but we would follow the provincial guideline. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to call the vote? All those in favor? And that passes. Okay, our next one is page 67. The staff recommend a repeal of the water extraction for the purpose of commercial bottled water sales. Director Toth.
Thank you, Chair. I'm actually wondering if we really do want to repeal this at all. I think it makes an important statement for our community and for others. But what I'm wondering is if we should, in item number 4, add, so it would say for the purpose of commercial bottled water export instead of just sales. Because sales technically prohibits a company like Noah's Water from operating, and they deliver water on the coast to places that don't have access to water.
I'm wondering if we could get some clarification from staff as to why this was suggested for repeal.
Thank you, Chair. The only information I have at this time is that the policy is no longer required.
So we have a comment about the importance of it. Sherry, would you? Sorry.
I was just going to add that it is a policy statement, and if the committee feels this is something they want to publicly maintain, although we have no authority or ability to enforce anything, it does signal a position statement of the board.
Director Bax.
So my director here to my right wants to make an amendment. Can I take a stab at it? That the amendment be in policy, at the last sentence in the policy statement, the end of the sentence would read, the purpose of commercial bottled water exports from the Sunshine Coast Regional District. Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, Sunshine Coast, because we're not bottling water.
Right, from the Sunshine Coast.
And the title
Export
would
from
be to
this,
change from sales to export.
yeah, and in the title to change it from bottled water sales to bottled water export.
So we've made a couple amendments there. Did you get that? And we are making a different recommendation from what staff recommends. So if I could get a motion. Director Toth moves, Director McMahon seconds. All those in favor? And that passes with the amendments. Our next one is the community amenity contribution for independent power and resource projects. This has been amended. If you have any questions of clarification, GM Hall is on the line to help. Is there any questions or somebody would like to make a motion? Director McMahon?
Just a question. I know there are a couple of IPPs in Area B. Are there any others?
There's some in Area F, but yeah, go ahead, Director Hall.
Thank you, Chair. That was the only addition I was going to make. There's at least one, maybe multiple in Area F as well. Thanks.
What is your pleasure, committee? Director McMahon?
I move that we adopt as amended.
And Director Bax seconds. All those in favor? And that passes. Our next one is strategic planning, and that's on page 72. Director Toth.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just curious why the board even really needs a specific policy around strategic planning, especially since by the time the changes are incorporated, it'd be a pretty short policy. So I don't know if the administration wants to speak to that.
Director McMahon, would you like to comment first?
I was going to raise exactly the same point. It's not clear to me why we have this policy at all. Particularly, I might add, is we don't, for instance, have a policy around the hiring of the CAO. And that's one that we might want to consider.
CAO McKinley, would you like to respond?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, maybe having a policy would have protected you from the clown you have now. Is that what you're saying? The answer to your first question is I don't believe it's a requirement. And I'm not sure that I didn't have a chance to reach out to all of the other regional districts to ask if they had a specific strategic planning policy. I looked on the web for a couple. I didn't see any. It's not a requirement. It's a process that you undergo. So from a perspective, is it required? I don't believe it's an absolute requirement. On the hiring of the CAO policy, we don't have a formal policy, or even and if GM Parker, if I get any of this wrong, he'll correct me. My understanding is that the current process, say for the last 3 hires, has been that staff, HR works with the board on the process they would like to use to hire the next CAO, which could be, internal process. It could be hiring a recruitment firm. There's many ways to go about hiring a CAO. One of the benefits to not having a prescriptive policy is it gives the board at the time, the flexibility to choose the process that they believe will result in the needs that they're expressing, which can differ from potentially from hire to hire. And I don't know if GM Parker wants to expand on that at all. I think that would be probably true of the last 3 hiring processes.
How would the committee like to proceed with the strategic plan side of it? Director McMahon.
I'll speak first to the strategic plan side of it. I don't think we need a policy. I think we could just repeal this and have done. On the hiring of the CAO, the reason I raised that is because I understand that one regional district, the outgoing CAO hired the next CAO without reference to the board. And I believe that's possible under legislation. So I just wanted to ask that question of staff.
So we have 2 separate items here. I would like to deal with the first one, and then we can always think about the other one. Director Toth.
I would like to move that we repeal the strategic planning policy.
That's seconded by Director McMahon. Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, I just
Director-
comment that I think that repealing might be the right idea because it does kind of, having a policy will be a little restrictive on the process that we do undertake for the strategic plan. So I'm in favor of that.
Okay, we have a motion that's been put on the table and seconded, ready to vote. All those in favor? And that passes. As to the second comments by Director McMahon, how would you like to proceed? This is Senior Manager Parker.
Yes, thank you. Just with specific reference to the comment made, the board through the Local Government Act can create a bylaw to appoint a chief administrative officer. And this board does have a bylaw. It's bylaw 633, exempt employment bylaw. So the board has the authority to appoint the chief administrative officer, not the CAO. Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Okay, we'll leave that for now. Thank you. Now we're down to room naming, parks and recreations. This is recommendation is a major overhaul. Director McMahon.
Yes, I'd like to move that this be referred to staff for the major overhaul along with the parks naming policy.
Director Toth seconds. We have any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'd like to call a vote. All those in favor? And that passes. Thank you. Finally, we're down to free ticket program. And this is also being suggested. It's a major overhaul. Any questions from the committee? Director McMahon?
This, to me, suggests that it's part of the social equity responsibility of the SCRD, and so it's a little broader than merely free transit tickets. So, yes. Happy to look for a revision.
Can I just get a seconder? We've got a mover, a seconder, Director Toth, and then you have a question. Is that right?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I guess I have a question around what differentiates the free transit tickets from like the free SCRD recreation passes. Do we have a policy for the recreation passes, or conversely, should the ticketing program just lump in with the rec center? Thanks.
Do we have a staff member that can respond to this? Go ahead.
So fees and charges are established by bylaw, so I would say that they would need to be dealt with separately per the bylaw. And if we have a policy for free, that should also be reflected in the rates, in the bylaw rates. So that's why I wouldn't want to actually merge them together.
Does that clear it up for people? Director Toth?
I guess, so the converse of that question is, should we have a policy for our recreation passes that we give out? So I see them as comparable sort of items, and we have a policy for one and not the other, and maybe we've got one under bylaw but not the other. So there's a lack of harmonization here.
So would forwarding this as a recommendation for major overhaul with the addition of synthesizing how we approach this would be something you'd support? Can I get a motion to that effect? Director Toth, seconded by Director McMahon. If there's no other comments or questions, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? And that passes. Okay, now we're on to, great work, by the way. That was a lot. We have the attachments just for reference, and now we're on to Annex C, where we have a recommendation that the Board Policy Review Committee identify and prioritize the policies. And there's background to, I think it was 2 further policies below. Who would like to speak to this? Staff? Manager Parker, if you'd like to follow up.
Thank you, Chair. While we were reviewing some other policies within the Human Resources Department, we found these 2 policies. They were labeled as operational policies, but then we did some background checking and found they were actually passed by previous boards through resolution. So we wanted to make sure they were addressed in the appropriate manner, and that's why they're on the report in front of you today. Happy to take any questions.
Any comments or questions? Director McMahon.
I would like to move that these 2 policies be repealed.
Do I have a seconder? Director Toth, any comments, questions? Not seeing any. All those in favor? And that passes. Thank you. So we did have an additional piece of, or additional business under new business, and that is advancing identified policies for revision. And that is in reference to page 80 and 81 of our agenda package. Director McMahon, would you like to speak to this?
What I'm going to suggest is that we ask staff to report back to us on all of the policies that are due for major revision, so that we have a list of all those policies that are being reviewed, and some timelines for when this might best be accomplished, so that we can just take a look and flag anything that the board might feel is urgent, that might be prioritized ahead of some of the other policies. Also, if we could get a sense from staff of how big a job some of these are. Some of them might be minor, and others, I suspect, are going to be a significant amount of work, but it would be nice to have them all in a short report in one place, so that we know where they are and where they're going. I think that was a motion. Did I make a motion?
Can you maybe simplify?
Sure.
it?
Okay, move that staff report back to Committee of the Whole a future committee of the whole on all of the board policies that are under review. Major revision.
I'll just give the minute taker a chance. And if staff would like to speak further to this, Officer Reed?
Just for clarification, if you want indication of timelines, we would include that in the resolution as well.
Comma, with an indication of timelines.
Would you like that read back?
Thank you. A motion that staff report back to a future committee of the whole on all of the board policies that are under major revision with an indication of timelines.
Do I have a seconder? Director Toth? Any other comments? All those in favor? And that passes. Thank you.
Question. I have a question that was brought up of a policy.
Go ahead, Director Bax.
When are we supposed to wear purple on Thursdays, or was it blue? I did some research on this, and there was a policy that they were talking about last year.
Is this new business that requires
No,
response
I'm
quickly?
taking a stab at a joke, but I did do some research on this particular committee, and there was discussion about what color of clothing you should wear on Thursdays last year.
Now I'm interested. As far as I can tell, anything we were tabling, we actually had addressed with the appropriate staff. So I think I'd like to have a motion. There's nothing in camera. I'd like to motion to adjourn. Director Toth, seconded by Director McMahon. All those in favor? Passes. Thank you. Thank you, staff. Thank you, committee. That's it for the year.